Welcome to NCC lecture series. This is lecture number 49. Today we discuss communication skills. We have discussed many aspects of communication skills in the previous lectures. Today we are discussing barriers to effective communication. No matter how good and effective a communicator one may be, yet the fact is that one does face certain barriers from time to time which forces them to work on becoming even more effective in their skills to communicate. In order to be successful in communication, one has to understand many barriers that can impede you from communicating your ideas. And there can be many barriers to effective communication. The main barriers can be at two levels. One is the barriers to listening. The other is barriers to speaking. Today we are discussing the barriers to listening. So there are many barriers to listening. One of the barriers to listening is interrupting the speaker. So we have a speaker speaking on, lecturing on one topic, and if the audience, or it could be any kind of interruption can happen from the audience, or interruption can come from maybe some other side, just like the mobile phone or any other devices of the speaker is just being turned on suddenly, and this kind of, or the arrival of a messenger, or the engagement in something else during the lecture, all this can just lead to listening barriers. The listeners will be prevented from listening carefully. So interrupting the speaker is one of the barriers to listening. And now let us look at the second barrier. The second barrier to listening is not maintaining eye contact with the speaker. So the listeners, they must just look at the speaker, and we have to understand the fact that the lecture or a talk is successful not just by listening to the sound alone. So if we need to understand the speaker completely, we need to have a one-to-one eye contact with the speaker. So the speaker's modulation of voice, the tones, the intonation, the different emotions on the face, the gestures, all this will contribute to understanding the very message. So maintaining eye contact with the speaker is very important. These days, the listeners often do not maintain proper eye contact because they could be sometimes looking at their devices like the mobile phone or the laptop or even the books they have. So this kind of lack of care or lack of eye contact with the speaker will lead to the proper failure of understanding. So listening barrier number 2 is not maintaining eye contact with the speaker. Now let's look at the third barrier to listening. The third barrier to listening is rushing the speaker to complete what he has to say. So some of the listeners could be maybe upset about something, or they could have some other activities, planned activities. So they may ask the speaker to rush the topic and speed up and finish the topic all on a sudden. So this kind of rushing the speaker to complete what he has to say will also be a barrier to listening, because the subject has to be analyzed, interpreted, evaluated, and discussed in the proper way. Otherwise, there will not be a comprehensive understanding and discussion. So never rush the speaker to complete what he has to say. The fourth barrier to listening is making the speaker feel as though he is wasting the listener's time. So sometimes the listeners can be very passive and they would be just sending some negative impressions and negative messages. So if they are behaving such a way that the listener, the speaker feels that he is wasting the listener's time. So this is again, so the speaker will not be able to lecture in a very comprehensive and totally involved way, but the listener will not be able to understand the subject as well. So don't make the speaker feel as though he is wasting the listener's time or as though he is unwanted. So this feeling of unwantedness or rather unwanted will create some kind of disturbance or some kind of irritation in the speaker, and the speaker will not be able to give his maximum. So this is again another the barrier to listening. The fifth barrier to listening, that is of course an effective communication, is being distracted by something that is not part of the ongoing communication. So it can happen to the speaker, it can happen to the listener. Maybe the speaker is upset about something. He cannot focus on the topic he discusses. Okay, now I'm discussing barriers to listening. So if I cannot focus on barriers to listening and I'm speaking about barriers to listening, my speech will not be complete. Similarly, the lecture on any topic will not succeed if I as the speaker cannot focus on what I speak and the listeners cannot focus on what the speaker speaks. This is again another very important problem, that is being distracted by something that is not part of the ongoing communication. So the speaker and the listener have to focus on what is being spoken, and of course what is being listened. Alright, so this is very important. Maximum involvement in the speaking and listening must be there. And now we come to the sixth barrier to effective communication or listening barrier, that is getting ahead of the speaker and completing his thoughts. So there may be some very smart listeners in the audience, and the listeners can just understand or visualize what the speaker is going to speak next, and they would just speak it out loudly. So this will be creating problem to the speaker, and it will also create problem to the listener, very listener who is just visualizing everything, so also to the others. So it's creating a big problem in the audience. So don't be ahead of the speaker and completing his thoughts, right? Just go with your lecturer, go with your speaker. Don't try to outshine the speaker. Okay, so that will again cause problem to the very listener and of course to other listeners. Now the other impediment or barrier to listening is ignoring the speaker's requests. The speaker will depend on different methodology, and the speaker will be asking the audience to do certain things or request certain things, right? So the listener has to obey the request and pay some attention to the request of the speaker, otherwise that would again be a barrier to listening. And the next barrier to listening is topping the speaker's story with one's own set of examples. So the speaker speaks about different problems of globalization, different consequences of globalization, or rather some of the problems in the media world. So if the listener is stopping the speaker's story with one's own set of examples, there will be problem. So there will not be proper comprehension or understanding. So listeners have to cooperate with the speakers. Now the last barrier to listening is forgetting what is being discussed. This is again a barrier to listening. The listeners in the audience, they have to remember what is the subject. We are discussing, okay, barriers to effective communication. So if the listeners forget the subject that is being spoken on and just be in a different world of imagination, this can just lead to lack of understanding. And this is again another listening to barriers. So as listeners, we have always to remember that we should not interrupt the speaker. We should always cooperate with the speaker, and we should always remember the subject that is being discussed. So with that, we can be, of course, very, very effective in our communication as speaker as well as listener. So effective communication is not just for the speaker alone, it is for the listeners as well. So most of us are often listeners, and being a listener, we have to be very alert, vigilant, and obedient and respectful to the speaker. So this way we can be very effective in our communication. So always understand the fact that communication is not just one-sided. It does not mean the success of being a speaker alone. It also means being successful as a listener also. So consider all these 9 points which are barriers to listening, and be a very good listener. So also be a very good speaker, because only good listeners can be good speakers. So this will of course make you very good in your communication. You will be an effective communicator, and you will be of course a great leader and an all-rounder. In the next lecture, we are discussing barriers while speaking. So thank you very much for listening, and God bless you.